Good afternoon. This is the best place for me to be ever. It's with folks who are trying to change the world, place by place, state by state. So I'm so happy to be here. I'm embracing eldership today. And because I understand what it's meant, what it means. It doesn't mean age, it means some hard work. It might mean a little age, but it means folks who have been working in this struggle for a very long time. And these folks sitting here don't just talk about history, but they're still in the struggle. And so that's what's important. In your program, you have a thing that says Sankofa, looking backward to look forward. Are people familiar with Sankofa? Okay, so Sankofa, is I believe a mythical bird that comes out of the African tradition. And it's a picture of a bird, a huge bird, that's looking backwards and going forward. And that symbol is so much describes what we are doing tonight. We're really talking about history and the work we've done, all in the service of moving forward a struggle that we're all engaged in right now. So we couldn't have a more appropriate title for this panel and for what we're doing this next couple days. So I just want to say a little bit about that word. And I wrote it down, that Sankofa, an African word out of the African tradition, is a word from the Anka tribe in Ghana, symbolized by a bird with its head turned backwards while moving forward, carrying a precious egg in its mouth. The literal translation of the word and the symbol is, it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. It is not taboo to fetch what is at risk to be left behind. And that's just what we want to do tonight. We want to really look backwards so that we can move forward. So today we have this collection of social justice activists, brothers and sisters who have been collectively working in the struggle for social justice hundreds of years. But that is a collective body of work. But what is most important is that these folks continue to do that work. You know, it's not like people saying, I did that in 1960 or I did that in whenever, but that people are continuing to do the work, that they're continuing to fight for social justice where they are. They're continuing to build power and to make change in this country right now. And everybody's doing that in a different way. Everybody comes out of a different stream, but all flowing into this mighty river that means change over time. And so that's what we have tonight. So tonight we want to listen to folks on this panel. We want to make sure we don't lose our history and make sure we use it to move forward. Tonight will be a night where we hear people's histories, we hear people's stories. We have a chance to get their wisdom. And we also have a chance to learn from you in a dialogue that will follow. And so I'll tell you what this evening will look like. We'll ask each of the panelists to, in 3 minutes, tell us a little to introduce themselves. You all have a statement in your folder about who, they're laughing. You all have a statement about who they are, so you get a full picture. So this 3-minute snapshot is a chance for people to say what they want you to know about them in particular, but you have their full stories as they submitted them in your folders. So tonight, I'm just going to say who we have here, and then I'll ask them in this order to talk about themselves, and then I'll do the same at the end of that. When we're done with that, we'll proceed with a conversation among them for a short time, and then we'll open it up for the longest time so that people can ask questions, can make comments, can be fully part of this panel's discussion. So our panelists are Willie Baptist, Phyllis Bennis, Reverend Alvin Jackson, and Al McSurely. And so why don't we start with, yes, I think give them a big round of applause. So first we'll hear from them. If we can start with Willie, then Phyllis, then Reverend Jackson, and then Al.
Okay. Well, I want everybody to pray for me as I try to do a miracle. It takes 3 minutes for me to say hello, let alone. But I really want to underscore some points that Reverend Barber raised here, which sums up my life in terms of my experience. I think I made more mistakes than all y'all combined. I like to consider them mistakes. I can tell you what not to do, but I tried it all. But I think the point that he raised around the relationship of theory and practice is very important. Theory is the experience of a million people. It's not just your attitude, your experience. It's connecting your experience to the experience of history. You know, the experience, the patterns and lessons and so on. It's so important because at this time there's a disconnect between your generation and my generation, largely to preclude any kind of reference to history and to learn the lessons of history. There's no reason why you have to bump your head against the same wall that I bumped. Huh? You can go around it, over it, but you got to appreciate the history. Dr. King pointed out that an accurate prescription or cure to a problem requires an accurate diagnosis of the problem. If you think what's coming at us is a teddy bear, when in fact it's a grizzly bear, then you're in trouble, right? Yes, so this question of having theory, having an understanding of what we're dealing with is so important because the forces that we're up against, this is a lesson, hard lesson I had to learn, are very sophisticated. And they don't give two shits about any one of us, huh? They are very sophisticated in their exploitation, their oppression, and their living at the expense of our misery, huh? This is who we're up against, huh? So being able to defeat them, you must outsmart them. And learning from history and learning from our daily experience is very critical. So this point that Reverend Barber raised is something that has burned in my soul ever since I've made all the mistakes. I'm lucky to be here, you know, in terms of my life and the things I've tried and so on. The second point that's made in terms of what experience is that all the problems that we've dealt with, that we've talked about, and people have spoken to individually, there are 3 things we need to do to solve those problems. I want you to take notes. First, we need to organize. 2, we need to organize. 3, we need to organize. They don't give nothing about us coming as individuals or separate struggles. They only respond to people that we're up against that benefit from our misery. They only respond to power, and power grows from organization. So whatever we do, whatever we say, has to translate into this moving us organizationally. And the Poor People's Campaign, I think, is a very important in this respect. We're talking about the organizing of the most disorganized section of the population, which is disorganized on purpose. All of the strategy of the people that we're up against is predicated on the poor fighting each other. This room, they don't want this in this room. This is dangerous, huh? So we got to understand that. My point about my life has to do with the fact that at the age of 17, August 11, 0 minutes? Yeah. See there? Okay. Let me say this though. I'm telling you, that was just hello. Okay. But I'll make the other points during the course of the discussion. But this point I want to really raise because I think it underscores these times. I was really shaped by one major event in my life. When I was 17 years old, I lived in Watts, California. I was raised there. In August 11, 1965, 60,000 to 100,000 people hit the streets in militant protests against the inhumane condition that exists, precipitated by police harassment, but it had to do with the economic circumstances of the ghetto of Watts. Huh? You had upwards of 50 to 60% of unemployed youth. And that exists in all the ghettos throughout the country, and the whole of the country erupted. They have labeled that whole period of the late 60s as the greatest violent and mass upheaval since the Civil War. the point I want to raise here, that the conditions that gave rise to that, the homelessness, the housing, the healthcare crises, all the things we mentioned, they don't just reside in the poor black communities. They exist in every community. And it's important that we understand, and what I've come to understand is that underneath all our differences, there's this commonality of our oppression and exploitation. I lived in Watts, which was a highly segregated community. For all my life, all I thought of white folks was that they had money. Until I met I know she ain't got no money, I know you ain't got no money. I start seeing that the race question is tied to this question of class, and that's a critical question of leadership.
Wow. That's a hard one to follow, but thank you. I was going to talk a little bit about movements, because I think some of us were lucky when we grew up. I was just too young to be connected to the civil rights movement. I sort of heard about it as a kid. I'm like the junior in this group of seniors, barely, but it was enough to matter. But I think that one of the things that I was lucky enough to start college at 17 in 1968, which was the big year for the anti-war movement around Vietnam. And I was swept up into that, as so many people were. And it was linked from the beginning to the question of racism. There was a famous statement from that time that some of you have probably heard, that the Vietnam War, from the United States vantage point, was about white men sending young black men to fight yellow men. The women were sort of left out of the equation along the way, but nonetheless, that was the statement of the time, to fight yellow men to protect their rights to the land that was really owned by the red man. So the intersection of race and war, racism and the anti-war struggle, have been central to how movements emerge in the United States. And to fight that, what I learned, this was luck. I was the right age at the right place, and I met the right people who became my mentors and got the opportunity to learn an incredible thing, which included the notion that if we wanted to build a movement against the US war in Vietnam, we had to understand what Vietnam was all about. So we studied Vietnamese history. We studied Vietnamese poetry. It was an extraordinary opening of the vision of all of us youngsters with people who weren't very much older than us. They were 10 years older than us, but they had been around enough to realize, some of them had traveled to North Vietnam during the war, brought home prisoners of war, had met with the cadre of the National Liberation Front, came back and taught us that if you want to end a war abroad, you have to bring it home. And that meant you had to learn, and you had to become an internationalist. And so for me, the question of internationalism remains at the root of the work that I do. I run a project at the Institute for Policy Studies called the New Internationalism Project that works mostly on anti-war stuff, Palestinian rights, Palestine. When I was young, too young to be in the civil rights movement, I wasn't too young to be an active supporter of Israel. That's all I knew growing up. Nobody ever asked the question of this great socialist experiment that we were all very excited about, that we thought that's what Israel was, and none of us thought to ask the question, whose land was that before? Who owned the land where these great little socialist kibbutzim were being built? We didn't ask those questions. When I went to college and started working around Vietnam, I put that question aside. I just stopped thinking about it. And it wasn't until a few years later when something happened, I have to stop and I'll just finish this one story. Something happened that put the issue of the Middle East back in my face and said, you have to start thinking about this again. And being a good Jewish girl, I went to my father's library and read Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. And I saw his letters to Cecil Rhodes, the infamous British colonialist. And he wrote to Rhodes saying, I want your support in this project. And then he keeps writing, and Rhodes apparently never answered, but he keeps writing and he says, you might wonder why I'm writing to you. You're interested in Africa, I'm interested in this little slice of Arabia. You're concerned about Englishmen, I'm concerned about Jews. Why am I going to you? It's because our projects are both something colonial. I had never heard that before. And that's when I realized we need different teachers. that we can't only rely on the teachers that we grow up with by accident. And we have to fight to keep internationalism at the heart of everything that we do. So even here in the Poor People's Campaign, which is a U.S. mobilization, it's not a global mobilization, although it's linked with global things, we have to keep in mind that everything that happens in this country has resonance in the rest of the world.
Good. I went to college the year after Phyllis, 1969. I grew up in the Delta of Mississippi, Indianola, Mississippi, and went off to a little school in Orange, California, Chapman College. It was Chapman University. Now, somebody is here from Chapman, yes. A lot of orange groves, and there were maybe 10 black students on the entire campus. And I was there at Chapman, and folks looked around at me and said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "The Delta of Mississippi," and they said, "You poor little culturally deprived thing, you." But you know, growing up in that little small segregated town in Mississippi, I never saw myself as deprived. But I went to Chapman and then later on to Butler University. But I retired from ministry. Unlike most of the folks on this panel, I've not been directly and deeply involved in the movement. Most of my work has been on the inside, working with the institutional church, trying to get the church to engage outside the walls. After 43 years of ministry, churches around the country, I got a call early one morning from one William J. Barber saying, "We need you to come over and help us in the Poor People's Campaign. We need you to help us get ready for the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. We need you to be our Bayard Rustin." I don't know how many of you know who Bayard Rustin was, but Bayard Rustin was really the one behind the scene doing a lot of the organizing. They didn't want, the leaders, Roy Wilkins and others, really didn't want Bayard Rustin with a leadership role in organizing the march. He was a gay man. He had been affiliated with the Communist Party, and they didn't want him. They didn't want anything to do with Bayard Rustin. But A. Philip Randolph insisted on Bayard Rustin being involved, and so they asked A. Philip Randolph to serve as chair of the March on Washington, and he said, "I'll serve as chair if Bayard Rustin is my assistant." And so I'm kind of happy to be associated with somebody like that. But I received that call that early morning from Dr. Barber as maybe a call from God to be engaged. And so though I'm kind of, I have a few years on me, this is really an exciting time to be involved in the work. One of the things I like to talk about is that success is really not all it's cracked up to be. I've had some success, but really what we want is significance. Significance, to do something that's significant and impactful, and I kind of feel that this is what this work is all about, and I'm happy to be a part of it with you.
Okay, while I'm standing up, will you all get out your biographies? Should be in your packets. Everybody got your packet? And turn it to Al McSurely, that's me. Because I had no way in hell I'm going to get through any of this in 3 minutes. So, everybody got me? All right, here we go. We're starting right here. Go down to the third paragraph. I've been a part of the anti-Jim Crow movement for over 60 years in the South. It's the only place the revolution is going to start. I'm sorry, Bernie, but it ain't going to start in Vermont. It's going to start in the South, and it's going to be led by black people and a few white people that finally got the truth. Number two, in 1960, you'll see in the middle of that paragraph, I saw two people here from Fairfax I got involved in the movement in Gum Springs, Virginia. Right down, George Washington gave 100 acres of land to his only son, West Ford, and they founded a community called Gum Springs. That was the first anti-poverty war place in the country, Gum Springs. I helped organize that. It was editor of the Gum Springs News for 3 years. And then I got to work for the UPO. And from that, we became very familiar with Howard University, Stokely Carmichael, Chuck McDew, and all of the SNCC people that came out of Howard and across the South, including my brother who came out the other day in favor of Joe Biden, who was, as you know, was one of the first SNCC leaders in South Carolina, good friend of mine. In 1966, James Meredith took a march along in Mississippi called the March Against Fear. He was shot by the Klan from about 2 feet away. Stokely and Floyd McKissick, good friend of mine, the late Floyd McKissick, most of my friends are dead. And they came to Mississippi. Stokely from Howard had just taken a year off to go south and then became revolutionized in the South, started the slogan Black Power that he stole from Marcus Garvey. And Black Power swept the country just like sit-ins did in 60, this is 66, and started a tension that had developed in the movement from 60 to 66 between a very progressive nationalism and whether to use electoral work, given that you couldn't vote in the South if you were black. And the liberals all were trying to get us to register everybody to vote. And Ella Baker, who I want to mention in just a minute, told everybody, what the hell's wrong with that? It's a revolutionary act to try to vote when they won't let you vote. And it still is a revolutionary act in North Carolina today to try to go vote. So there's no contradiction between being doing electoral political work, and as far as that goes, violent and nonviolent political work too. There's no contradiction between all of our work is to expose the structural racism, which Jim Crow is my favorite word now because that's really what it is. It's the Jim Crow that was legal for a while, then we knocked it out in 1954. We meaning NAACP lawyers, which I am, and we came right from Howard University Law School, and we knocked it out in 1954, and we still haven't finished the work. You can tell by just looking at us today. We're still getting to know each other. If we'd have done that in 54, imagine, 54 is what, 46 years plus 20. 66 damn years we're supposed to be going to school together with each other. Because the 9 Supreme Court judges, all 9 of them said having separate but equal schools was what? Humiliating and tied up black people's brains and emotions and self-pictures like Chinese tied up their girls' feet. That's what Brown is about. So that was in 54. Now here I want to get to the last thing I wanted to get you to read in here. In spring of 1966, in spring of 1966, Black Power came, and my then wife, Margaret Herring, that some of you know, still kicking, barely. We're both 83, almost 84. Margaret's 84 now. I'm going to be 84 in 2 months. We decided to move to East Kentucky and be the Black Power representatives for Jim Foreman, SNCC, Ann and Carl Braden, Ella Baker, Fred Shuttlesworth, C.T. Vivian, and we moved there to try to tell the white people in Appalachia that black people weren't out to rape their mamas or anything like that. Black people were trying to get the same damn thing they were trying to get, and that was to have a decent life. I'll carry on from there when I get another chance.
So I'll say a little bit about who I am, and then we'll start with the conversation. I'm Roz Pellez. I am a strategic advisor to the Poor People's Campaign and work with repairs of the breach. I'm one of the older members of this panel and have been engaged in social justice work since I was 13, a member of the Congress of Racial Equality. Started in my church and have been active ever since. I've been active in various movements, labor movement in particular. I spent 18 years in the AFL-CIO, the last couple years as a civil women and human rights director. But my main work, and what I'm proud of, is the work I've done organizing in communities and in workplaces all over the country, especially the South. And I'll talk to people about this on the panel, but there's a time in my life when my commitment was gelled and made strong, and that was in 1979 at the Greensboro Massacre, when 5 of my friends were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Greensboro, North Carolina. And it was in that moment that I knew that my work had to continue, that the real reason that people were shot down had more to do with what they were trying to do than who they were. They were representing a movement that was trying to bring together rooms like this. Rooms of young people, people of color, LGBTQ people, folks who want to make a different world. And it was that moment that I knew that when I'm 71 like I am, that I had to still be in struggle, and that we needed a new system, a system that really appreciates everybody and where everybody can live a decent life in a country that's so wealthy. So that's basically my story, and I've had many things that happened since 1979, as you can imagine, but that was the turning point for me. And it gelled what I have done, and it's been a guide point to all the work that I've been doing. So that's who Roz Pellez is in a nutshell, and we can talk to other folks now and hear about some of those experiences. What I have to say about this group is 2 things. One is they are all continuing to do work. Nobody's sitting on their laurels. Everybody is working.
There's no laurels.
Oh, there's no laurels. Everybody is doing work. And the other thing is that we didn't have to go out and find these people. We didn't have to go out and go through their schedulers to get them to come. These are all folks who are committed to the Poor People's Campaign all over this country. These are folks who are thought leaders, who are organizers, who are writers, folks who are in this struggle and building the Poor People's Campaign. So that's what makes this panel even more special and even more important to the thing that we're trying to do over the next couple days. And so I just want to start with a simple question. And so it's like the massacre for me. For you, Willie, is there a thing where you knew, I'm in this? I mean, you talked a little bit about Watts, but is there a thing?
Well, I mean, what struck me most was my experience with organizing the Homeless Union in the late 80s and 90s. We organized some 25 locals in 25 states. At the height, we had anywhere between 25,000, 35,000 homeless folks. And what that taught me is that poor and homeless folks can speak for themselves. They can think for themselves. They can organize and fight, and they can lead. The stereotypes and images that we see that's being put in our face is not the truth of the situation of homelessness, and that problem is getting worse. And I got involved with that. I was part of the organizing team, and I would go out to the various areas to do preparatory work for the main team to come in. And I remember going to Chicago during what's it called, the mighty wind. The forecast was 50 degrees below zero, on the other side of zero, and homeless women and men and children are living in hovels no larger than the size of a doghouse, out in the cold, in this deadly weather. And we were trying to organize a chapter, start a chapter of the Homeless Union. And we did reconnaissance, and we had teams divided up, and our team went to the west side of Chicago. We were told that there was empty houses, boarded up houses, and there was this enclave of homeless folks living in these houses. This is 50 degrees below zero. And as we approached the house, there was this gentleman who was sitting in his seat with his back to us. And we would yell out, try to get his attention. And he didn't move. Then as we approached him closer, we yelled out again to try to get his attention. He didn't move. So finally we came upon him, and it turns out that this brother had froze to death. Of course, that left an indelible impression on me. But what was most indelible was the fact that it took about 3 of us to try to wedge this brother away from the chair. And when we did finally disconnect him from the chair, you can see deposits of his skin. This is in America, huh? That can produce a prefab house in 45 minutes. Huh? They have empty houses, and you got grown adults and their kids sleeping out there. You have homeless students now. The ranks of homeless students are growing. So this homeless issue, which lies at the root of, at the base of the problems of this country, is growing by leaps and bounds in the richest country in the world. And that particular experience and the general experience of the homeless organizing throughout the country really got me to think more about the need for revolution. That this problem can't be resolved halfway. You know, it has to be totally turned around. And so that struck me.
So there are many, many moments like that. Would one other person want to recount their moment?
Well, I've had 8 lives, so I think as Willie said, he's lucky to still be alive. Now, I've been hanging out with all these preachers since I met Reverend Barber, and they say they believe in all kinds of faith kind of things, Willie. I'm surprised you haven't heard about that. So the guy, Reverend Spearman, that I now work with, is head of NAACP in North Carolina. He says there is no such thing as luck. You're blessed. You're blessed. He said, I don't know the word luck. He says, you're so blessed you're still around. You don't know like that. And that's the way I think now. You know, the Klan tried to kill me. That's all documented in here. The FBI said they came by. The FBI did not try to kill me, but they certainly covered up the investigation of the Klan, 8 sticks of dynamite thrown at my head and my then wife's head and kid's head in about a month after Nixon had won the president campaign in 1968, about 5 months after they had murdered Dr. King, and about 3 months after the first Poor People's Campaign that I helped bring the Appalachian contingent on. So all that for me, that's sort of a blur now, though I've been writing about it, but so I can remember a lot of the facts, but it was like bang, arrested for sedition, thrown in jail, trial for sedition, then go to Chicago for the National Conference of New Politics in the Vietnam summer, which I'd worked for both NCNP and for the Vietnam summer in '68. After we got done with the Poor People's Campaign, that was right out here near where I was brought up, in Resurrection City. We had brought 2 buses. I know some of you, this is sort of still the model of what we're going to try to do 6/20/2020. So it is important to think about. Back then, there is no doubt in my mind, and I can show you the FBI documents if anybody is interested, that the Senator John McClellan's committee and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had a very sophisticated and violent alliance with the D.C. police right down the hill from Howard to make sure that campaign never came off. And they called the Washington Spring Project, and they had they had enough spies within the all around the nation to block raising money. Roz, I don't know if you've ever seen some of that stuff, but they would not allow anything like what we've done so far happen back then. I mean, we're so far ahead of where we were then. Although SCLC had core, no, well, just SCLC at that point had a strict nonviolence practice, a Gandhian practice. Certainly SNCC and core and the movement that we were all a part of, was questioning, we'll call it, like, had a big Q after it, like LGBTQ. We had kind of a Q after nonviolence at that point, with because many of us felt like certainly self-defense, where so many of our brothers and sisters were getting at least beaten the shit out of them and getting killed, that we were reluctant to give up our God-given right to self-defense at that point. So, Hoover and McClellan knew, that was a tension within the movement, and they were wedging that like crazy.
That's right.
They were coming right in there.
Yeah.
They would get Stokely, who went to school here, so it's really interesting that we're talking about it right here. And when Dr. King was killed, Stokely and some of my brothers, I was not here, I was down in the mountains, but they burned down about half of 14th Street and Georgia Avenue the night Dr. King, the second night after he was killed. And Washington had a fire all over it. So my point is that back then, the movement we are so far ahead in terms of training a significant mass. I'm looking at Ra, a significant, what do you call it? Critical mass.
Yeah.
A critical mass of people, which I hope you all will be part of.
Yeah, and I think they are part of that critical mass we are doing right now.
That really have some training in nonviolence.
Yeah.
When we brought our 2 busloads up here, I'm almost done.
So
with it.
Al, I'm gonna let you finish that last piece because I don't want you to tell it all because I want to come back
this
and
is
talk
one
about
story, one
and,
story.
and then so Al, what I want to do is to hear this last point here, and then come back because I want Al to talk about how he was in the first meeting that Dr. King called to begin the thinking about with other folks the first Poor People's Campaign. So I want you to hold a little bit so we can get to that. And wanted to you'll remember. I remember. You remember. But what a bunch of us have talked about in some way or another is the question about religion, the church or faith, or different ones. And so I wonder, Reverend Jackson, what we've seen is in movements throughout history, the role of the faith communities. And so I wonder, both looking back and now, what is the influence there and what is the state of that support and leadership within movements?
I think it's, I remember, but first of all, I remember meeting Dr. King in late 1969. He came to Indianola with Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer singing that song, oh freedom, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And my parents had dared me to go down to the courthouse to the march. I went anyway, and I remember meeting Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer, and then a few months later, Dr. King being assassinated in Memphis. It's really the church. It's interesting. In 1963, there were no major denominations who endorsed the march. It's been an ebb and flow with churches being involved, and it's been a part of the work that I've tried to do and others have tried to do to really kind of engage the church in social justice, but it's been a checkered. It's a checkered record. It's not a good picture, I would say. It's not a full picture.
And so I would invite others to even though questions are directed to one of you, I would invite others to respond as well to these various questions. I want to ask.
One thing on the faith thing, the idea of reaching out to the white church people, which Poor People's Campaign has done very systematically ever since we started it. When the first Poor People's Campaign, Dr. King had been kicked out violently out of his own Southern Baptist, what do you call it, the National Baptist thing, and he was reaching out through the anti-Vietnam War thing. He'd met some Jim Coffin and people at Yale Divinity, somebody here at Yale Divinity. And there were some groups, clergy and laity, concerned and things like that, who were trying to help Martin from the
So we can't hear you.
anti-war thing.
Closer.
From the anti-war movement. But the way we've been doing it, which is trying to go save the disciples of Christ or the Presbyterians or the, large Christian fellowships, particularly, and Catholics too, is so much more systematic and with more faith to it too. I think Martin could have actually got some of these white Christians, certainly in the South too, if he'd have tried, but he didn't even dawn on us at that time.
I think Phyllis wants to comment here.
Just quickly, I think these days there's, the notion of silos, right? That movements tend to be divided. People who work on climate don't necessarily work with the people who work on immigrant rights, who don't necessarily work with the people who work on police brutality, who don't necessarily work on the anti-war side. There's silos. People work in their silos, and that the struggle to bring down the silos is a big one. One of the silos in my generation growing up in the movements was always how faith-based organizing happened, as opposed to, it was always thought about that way, as opposed to either community organizing or student organizing, different communities. I think one of the things we're seeing now is a greater intersectionality that engages people at a whole bunch of different levels on issues that work together, that come out of faith-based traditions, come out of other traditions. But I also think when we look back at our history, for me, the most important of Dr. King's speeches was always the Riverside Church speech beyond Vietnam. It was where he made the link. He didn't just say, I'm against the war. That by itself was huge, and it probably is what sparked the move towards his assassination. It took place 1 year to the day before he was assassinated. And it's also true that in that speech, he laid out this model of the necessary intersection between war and racism. When he talked about the military budget and said that the military budget is taking the food out of the mouths of hungry children, the shirts off the back of cold people. That was something that had not been a general understanding in the civil rights movement and not in the anti-war movement, to make those linkages. And I think it's one of the great gifts of being part of the Poor People's Campaign is seeing that emerge, both in the strategic sense that Al is talking about, that Alvin's talking about, but also seeing the examples when the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign gets up, when Liz gets up and talks about the question of war and militarism, it's powerful, because she's talking as somebody who comes out of the movement around poverty. When Reverend Barber goes to the convention of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and talks about the question of Palestine as an issue of colonialism and apartheid, that's huge. Not because he's the first one to use that language, he's not even close to first. But he's in a whole different position, so the attention that gets paid is different, and I think that's a really important thing.
I was going to say that one of the principles of organizing that we've held on to is this notion that Muhammad has to go to the mountain, because the mountain ain't going to come to Muhammad. The mountain are the people. And to go to the people is to understand the people. Now, the question of religion is very profound in the American culture. It's not just organized religion, the churches, is the religiosity of the American people. And to organize them, students, I don't care, you have to understand and respect religion. You know, this is not proselytizing, just respecting who you're trying to organize. They are very religious, huh? You don't mess with people's Jesus. That used to be the statement that we did in the Homeless Union. You respect that and you understand that. So I think this is going to be a real challenge. I think the Poor People's Campaign is in a good place because that is recognized, that's understood. And I think the response of just ordinary people like the homeless, they might not go to church because of embarrassment or whatever the case may be, but they're very God-fearing. Most of our organizing among the homeless was in churches. The largest convention, founding convention of the Homeless Union, our local, was New York City at Riverside Church. We had over 1,200 delegates of homeless folks who went to every nook and cranny. But they flocked to the church because King was there. They flocked to that church because they fear God. They have a certain religiosity, and that's something that has to be really understood to move the American people, because that's the only way you're going to move these issues. You got to understand religion, especially in the South, huh? And I think this is a very important problem that we got to come to terms with if we're talking about actually organizing the people to do something for their own lives and move this country.
So we've got a variety of folks who are doing various things that are movement building, that are part of movement building around the country. And people have this notion about what an activist does and what an activist is. And so I just wanted to add, just quickly, Phyllis, talk to you about your work. Phyllis introduced herself as working at the Institute for Policy Study. Phyllis is a thought leader in the country and is all on the radio and TV and all that, really shaping the way we are thinking about issues. And so could you talk a little bit about how you see that serving movement? Because I think that's an important thing. We don't all have to carry a sign every week, and we don't all have to have a certain place, but we all have to find that place. And so could you just talk a minute about that?
Yeah. So IPS is a think tank, right? I'd heard about IPS when I was a young kid because it was from IPS that this book came that was called The Vietnam Reader. That was kind of the Bible of the anti-war movement. And I knew it was put together by people at this place called the Institute for Policy Studies. I didn't have a clue what the Institute for Policy Studies was. I didn't know what a think tank was. It's like, oh, people sit around and think great thoughts. You know, usually they're thinking about lunch most of the time, you know, but there's this sense of what does that even mean? For us, like most movements, our goal is to change the world, right? We talk about turning ideas into action for peace, justice, and the environment. That's our elevator speech, if you will. But what does that mean in the real world? What makes us different from the other think tanks, from Brookings or the Heritage Foundation or these right-wing think tanks, or something like Brookings that's sort of centrist, or something like the Center for American Progress that's kind of liberal, what makes us different, aside from like the substance of what we do, is our theory of change, right? The notion of theory is really important, what Dr. Barber was talking about. Our theory of change is that social movements make change. You don't make change by having a brilliant idea and writing it up in some brilliant way and getting it on the desk of somebody in power in Washington. You know, most of the other think tanks, that's kind of what they do. They think up ideas and they say, okay, who can we get? We can't get to the president, but we can get to Senator blah blah, and we can have breakfast with Senator blah blah's 22-year-old assistant who just started this week but has the ear of the senator. And we're like, okay, we might want to do that at some point, but that's not what changes the world. So what changes the world is people. Yes. People in the streets, yes. People in the suites, people electing other people. But people need ideas, they need analysis, they need facts. So what we do at IPS, we work with a bunch of different movements. We write stuff, we write talking points, we write fact sheets. The fact sheets that you all have probably seen in the Poor People's Campaign that are by each state, that has all of the numbers, like how much of the military budget is being paid for by the taxes in Indiana. And instead, what could that money go to if we were going to spend it on putting kids in Head Start or health care for adults or whatever? That research is being done by a team at IPS that comes out of something that was called the National Priorities Project, which used to be a separate project, and we've kind of absorbed them. They're fabulous. They write cheat sheets for the rest of us. It's great. And their work and my work and other people's work is to do the kind of deep dive into the research. We work with Shally. Where's Shally? She's around somewhere. She was around. Anyway, Shally is our liaison to the production side of the Poor People's Campaign. So we act as the, what does Reverend Barber call us all the time? The research arm of the Poor People's Campaign. And we work together, we do the writing together, we edit together, we fight over language. You know, we do all that stuff collectively. Yeah, we do a lot of that. We do all of that collectively so that our work jointly can reach as many people in as broad a movement as possible. So if it's going on TV to reach a broad audience, or if it's doing a webinar or a teach-in for a consolidated movement audience, you use different language, you talk about different approaches, but you're saying the same things. You just have to learn to speak it in a different language with each audience. And that's a lot of what we do. And then we train other people. We have a great internship program, a fellowship program, where we train people to do that when they go home to their own movements. So it's about empowering movements to have a voice that has broader reach.
So, and that's what we've heard a lot about on this panel over the course of the last hour or so, is that the importance of analysis. And like an example with IPS is that the number we're using to talk about poverty in this country is not what the U.S. government talks about. The U.S. government says we have 40 million poor people. But and that's their way of measuring. They have another measurement that they've not talked about that takes into consideration more than the money you bring home, but how you spend that money. And that number is so much bigger. So the Poor People's Campaign started to talk about that number. Nobody was talking about it. We go to our brothers and sisters at the IPS because, like Reverend Barber said, we don't want to be loud and wrong, but we say to them, we've got this number. Help us promote it, figure out, tell us it's right first, and then let's move it out. And that's what happened. And so what we've done is we've changed the narrative based on this research and work around what is poor in this country. Who are the people that are impacted by all these isms? Who are the people we have to protect? Who is the new working class? So that's what this kind of work can do. Al, I saw your hand. No?
So I think these two things are related. One of the key wedges in the late 60s, same period that I was running into trouble with the law about every other day, from 66 to 70, that period, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover had a COINTELPRO program that was designed to split the Jewish faith and the Jewish leadership that had always been in the NAACP, certainly, and in SNCC and in CORE. There was, in all three of the those were three major groups, and then there was two or three other ones, certainly SCEF, the organization I worked with, Ann Braden and Ella Baker's organization. And we knew that about half of the money that was sent to the South for SNCC, which was $1 million at one point, $1 million a year, came from Jewish people in New York. And we would go to New York and raise money at people's houses. And I've seen FBI memos, which I can share with anybody that wants to see them, that says we've got to cut this money off. We have to divide the Jewish faith, which has justice as its middle name practically, from being so close to friends with Stokely Carmichael, and they made a big deal out of any time Ralph Featherstone, a good friend that got killed, and anybody else that said anything against Israel. That was some of the beginning times of what Phyllis is talking about in 60, 68, 69, and 70. So that it's called a wedge. A wedge, and that wedge was very effective. And they promoted any anti-Semitic statements by any black leader, no matter where they were. And on the other end, they made sure that got into more conservative Jewish leaders' brains. That was that COINTELPRO. And I wanted to give you an example of that here in Washington, which I think is a little bit before your time, in '69, what was called the National MOB, and it grew out of IPS, and Art Waskow, that some of you had met, was the leader of that, and Marcus Raskin and Jamie Raskin, his son. You've seen him on TV recently. There was a lot of people who hoped that this alliance that was developed, and that Dr. King was right in the middle at the first, which the Vietnam Summer in '67 would pull together, again, this national black-white alliance around anti-war and anti-racism. Those were the two wings of this eagle. And so I want to read for you just this one little part from, this is a book by Caroline Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's daughter, that she wrote. One part of it is about me, and I have to admit the only part I ever read was the one that was about me. That's the Fourth Amendment, but in the First Amendment, the story that Caroline Kennedy and her partner Ellen Alderman from Columbia Law School wrote was about trying to disrupt and divide and keep this national mobilization, which was what we call the anti-war movement, having the largest demonstration ever in Washington. Up until then, the March on Washington had been the largest, and this was in November of 1969, and it did have 300,000 people, but it would have had 500,000 easily if we'd have been able to tap the black people in D.C. We're going to have this thing. We're going to have this 6/20/2020 in D.C. And the fact is, if you try to organize demonstrations in D.C. before, the big problem is getting most of the people here and getting them back home again after you get them here. No problem if you live in D.C. You go down, get on the metro, and you go to the demonstration, and you go back home, and you can go the next day. And the fact is, the FBI knows that, and the D.C. Police Department knows that better than anybody in this room.
Yeah.
Are everybody with me?
Yeah.
So here's how they were trying to stop it. I'm just going to read you. Art Waskow
the mic.
Okay. At his urging, the new MOB was still debating the proposal that Abe Bloom, remember him? Did you know Abe?
It's a friend.
Abe Bloom received a typewritten letter signed by Reverend Doug Moore. He's a friend of mine. He's from North Carolina. Did you know Doug Moore?
I know Abe.
Yeah. Anyway, Doug Moore was a militant black preacher here in Washington during that period. And he said, we will come out, but you're going to have to help give us $25,000, basically. And he was telling Art Waskow and people like that for that. And the FBI found out about it, and an FBI agent assigned to COINTELPRO were directed to investigate groups and individuals that the Bureau perceived as dangerous. They were talking about black militants at that point. The These were targets through disruption, interference, and harassment. Anti-war and civil rights groups were targeted by 2 branches of the COINTEL program at the FBI, which is
Yeah.
on Constitution Avenue.
So you're really talking about this division
Oh,
that
yeah.
the government was
Yeah.
trying at that point, and is still trying to divide us all who come from different places, different walks of life, different races, and folks who are differently engaged in struggle.
Put out
So,
cartoons and stuff, very racist cartoons, and made it look like it was coming out of the IPS, basically, and vice versa.
yeah,
And
so-
I'm telling you, we're up against some people, and although I think the FBI is slightly better now, Trump and his people are not.
I wouldn't count on that, Al.
No, I don't
But
count on nothing.
But what I do appreciate is this lifting up that every attempt will be made to divide us, because that's something that's critical to know. What I really want to do, and what I think is the most important thing to do, is to open this up. Is that right, Colleen? Because that's where we learn. You get to ask questions and we get to respond. I'm going to ask the panelists. I mean, you can direct questions to anybody in particular, or you can raise questions and for anybody to answer, you can make a comment. I'm going to ask us all to be brief so that we can get as many voices in the room, because people have various things to say, questions to ask, and things to teach us. Because one of the last questions I'm going to ask this panel is about what we're learning from you, what we're learning from this generation of organizers, because I've learned a lot, and it's changed how I do my work. And so that'll be the last question, but now let's just open this up and hear from y'all. If somebody could help me with the mic here. Thank you so much. I see a hand in the back. So I think he had a question first, and then he can do it.
Could anybody on the panel talk about urban, rural, suburban, organizing the differences? And there's a second microphone, and then.
Yeah, I think this is where, the kind of analysis that IPS is doing, we're all going to have to try to learn how to research and assess the situation that we're dealing with. And we have, those of us who are part of the National Union of the Homeless now, we're moving to reestablish it, and we support very strongly the poor people. We've noticed that in our first effort to organize the homeless, we stayed in the big cities, particularly in the black ghettos and in the barrios. That's where and so the Homeless Union reflected that in its composition. But this time around, we noticed that with the gentrification, that the poor is being pushed out into the periphery, into small and rural areas, and that we have to combine our work in these bigger cities with our work in these smaller cities. I think this is a very important kind of thing, because you find these big cities, the influence of the powers that be are strongest, but in these smaller cities, so-called Trump country, you find people are hurting, really hurting. You never hear about it. So I think this relationship of the rural areas with the big cities, all that has to be taken into account when we think in terms of how we're going to organize. This time around, our largest locals, we had most of our locals are in small towns, and they largely are poor, white, homeless. In fact, in Marysville, this is the first time, last year was the first time they celebrated King's birthday, because they thought King was just a black leader, that they didn't know about the Poor People's Campaign. And so once they found it, you got all these mainly poor, homeless whites who are celebrating the King's birthday. These are areas of organizing. If we're going to move this country, we got to move the entire country. And we just can't stay in one locale. And so this is a very good question, because I think my analysis would say we would have to combine our work in these bigger cities with the work in the rural areas, especially with these hospitals that are closing in these rural areas where people are really hurting. It's just that you don't hear about it, but it's there.
Just one quick addition to that, on the question of the anti-war mobilizing, the anti-militarism component of what the Poor People's Campaign stands for, this is where you see a very sharp divide in terms of who goes into the military. During my work in the Vietnam era anti-war movement, most of the majority, the disproportionate number of people among the troops were young black and brown men from the ghettos and the barrios who were forced in by the draft. White people, middle-class people got deferments of various sorts in the main. So there were, of course, more white people in there because there's more white people in the country, but proportionately, it was way higher among black and brown people. These days, it's very different with the so-called volunteer army, which is not volunteer, but it's a draft of poverty, it's a draft of lack of opportunity that operates. It's not a legal draft, but it's a functioning draft. And what happens there is you don't have the same racial dynamics. The racial divide in the military is more or less proportional to their populations. Where you do see the disproportionality is people who come from rural areas and small towns of less than 25,000. That's both the highest numbers of casualties and the highest numbers in the military. If you look at who covers the military in the mainstream press, they almost never know anyone in the military. They don't have that experience. So it's a real gap that organizations like the veterans groups that work with the Poor People's Campaign, Veterans for Peace, About Face, Veterans Against the War, all of these organizations are working to cross that. And that, I think, is a crucial component of how our work goes forward.
That's right. So I'm going to move
I just want
around.
to make 2 points. One is to the original question, which was how's it different, rural and urban? And the thing I see today, my wife and I work mainly in a rural county, is the digital divide. Poor people that live in rural parts of North Carolina, at least, are not even hooked up to the internet, and they send their homework home, and you don't have have Wi-Fi or whatever. And certainly all this tweet, as Reverend Barber says, that goes over 90% of the people's head that we work with. And you throw a little literacy gap in there, and you got a real problem if you're talking about trying to reach really poor people, black and white.
Right.
That's number one. On the draft, it was different in the 60s because there was a draft. And in the most people that were killed were from West Virginia and East Kentucky and
That's
Virginia.
right.
When we were organized, we were there in 66, 67. I wrote a pamphlet that said, I know a guy who shot off his fingers. And that was the most popular pamphlet in the mountains. And we pushed, Quaker peace programs and stuff for people to get out of the draft. And we had a Kentucky conference on the war and draft. We had 500 people, all white, come to the thing. How do we keep them going to Vietnam?
That's right.
So now we don't have a draft, and what we see is, the judges send
It's a
our
draft
white
of the
kids
poor.
into the army. Yeah,
It's a
that's what
draft of
happened.
the poor. So I'm going to take this mic around, and people raise their hands, and I'm going to get to you. I want to remind our panelists to let it, so we can get it to be as concise as we can, and so we can get around. There are lots of folks in here who have their hands up.
This question is for Mr. Willie, but also anyone else who wants to answer. You mentioned specifically that you've made a lot of mistakes in the past, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the successes, but I think it's really important to learn from the mistakes. So could you speak to one or two of those things that you really want us to take away and to learn from?
Good question. I think this question of the relationship of study to practice. My education partly came out of book learning, which is the colleges basically, and what I call the School of Hard Knocks, University or University. I think I've been lucky to combine those two, and I think that's where education comes. For a long time, I didn't appreciate that. I kind of went headstrong into activities, and I can tell you stories that will have you walking on your ears in terms of things that I try to do in terms of organizing gun clubs and all that kind of stuff and doing some crazy stuff. And it could have gotten me killed. But it was because I didn't think through the problem. And we have, even though we have a so-called sophisticated educational system, there's an anti-intellectualism that we all have in our society. We don't have time to think. And people we're up against are no joke, like Reverend Barber pointed out. They are sophisticated. They hired the best political scientists, the best anthropologists to study us on how to deal with us. And I used to go into the struggle ill-equipped in terms of understanding who am I fighting? What am I fighting? What's their weak point? What's their strong point? Where can we make a breakthrough? I think that is the fundamental error. If I were to count all the errors I made, it came down to I didn't think through the problem. You know, I tended to jump before I leap. I mean, I leap before I look. I shot before I aim. You know, that's our culture. We don't have time to think. We got to just go do. A lot of my mistake was just going out there and almost getting my ass killed because I hadn't thought through what in the hell I'm dealing with. So I would say that's the main, but I'm telling you, be here all night. You want to hear all the other ones.
You can tell at dinner because people are going to sit at various tables tonight, and so people can tell all those stories, including the gun club.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question for Reverend Jackson, I think specifically. You talked about the people in the church and the faith communities and not getting them engaged, and I'm wondering if you can explain why that was the case.
You know, one of the things that I'm not sure that I know why, but one of the things that this campaign has addressed, you know, we talk about the 5 interlocking evils, injustices, systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war-based economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. As Brother Baptist said, you know, this is a very religious country, and we use a lot of religious language, but there is this false moral narrative around that if you are, you know, and it kind of goes like, you know, if you are for, you know, against, you know, for guns, you know, the Second Amendment for guns, against women, against, you know, abortion, you wrap yourself in the flag, and then you're somehow holy and righteous and religious. And so, you know, a part of the work, it seems to, of our work is to present a counter narrative. And as we hear from Reverend Barbara and Reverend Liz and folks in the movement all the time, it's really about going to the deepest parts of our faith and what the scriptures, the Hebrew prophets talked about. It's about what we do for the least. It's what we do for the poor, for the immigrant, for the outcast, the rejected. And so that is on us to change that narrative. And it's ongoing work. It was why Dr. King, the division with Dr. King and John H. Jackson, who headed the National Baptist Convention, you know, one of the great preachers in the country, but it was, you know, was a lot of preaching on personal salvation. And Dr. King comes and said, you know, well, personal salvation is great, but, you know, we need to talk about, you know, we need to talk about the society, the world. And so there's often a disconnect around that, and so we just have a lot of work to do.
All right, I have got a person here. So
I wanted to add one thing.
Let me try to move around the room a little bit.
I think we only have about 5 more minutes. Right?
So let's just move around the room and get some more questions.
Oh, yeah, that would be good. This question is for Phyllis specifically. You talked about your role in like pro-Palestinian organizing. I think that's a really hard space. Like, I resonate with that. Being a Jewish person trying to do organizing against Zionism, I think it's a really hard place to be in, and like finding conflict in both communities, like both in, I feel like, leftist spaces that don't necessarily acknowledge that like I had so much Zionist education growing up, and like how do you deconstruct that? But then also like in spaces, Jewish spaces that are still very much pro-Zionist. So I was wondering like how you confront that and how you manage that conflict. So I think it's really interesting.
So I'm going to let you answer that, and then I'm going to collect the next couple questions. So if you go ahead and answer that one, that's a tough one.
The quick version is organizations. Organize, organize, organize. Don't ever try to do this stuff on your own. I was lucky. I had amazing mentors who taught me, among other things. I was very lucky that the great Edward Said was one of my mentors, who taught me how to think about the Palestinian struggle in the United States, right? Now, I work very closely. I'm on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is explicitly anti-Zionist. That's a new position, as just this last year or so. It was a position that took about 5 years to get to it, because people were all over the place on what it means. But I think the key thing is organizing with other people. So that's number one. Number two is the discourse has changed so dramatically. I think it's something all of our movements, when we're in the weeds of fighting racism, fighting against poverty, fighting against war, we sometimes have a very hard time recognizing that we have succeeded in certain ways. Maybe not in any given moment. We didn't stop that war. If you look at the press on Israel-Palestine today, it's terrible.
Yeah.
But if you compare it to what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's a new world. And sometimes we have to take that step back and say, oh my God, we've really made some progress here. And therefore, it's really true that it's not political suicide to criticize Israel. We just have to show the members of Congress that that's the case. Not just tell them, but show them. So that's the challenge, but it's a different challenge than when it really was political suicide to criticize Israel.
Right.
So it's recognizing our successes is sometimes a real challenge.
Yeah, that's right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get a series of questions and then send those back to the panel. So we've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, so my question is related to the educational piece. I've had the honor of listening and learning from Mr. Willie Baptist on a number of issues. But the one thing I'm noticing is Dr. King had a very good analysis on capitalism. Fred Hampton had a great analysis on capitalism. But as a young person, what I'm kind of seeing from some of the prominent elders in the movement is that analysis is lacking. I live in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm gonna be a young person right now and just say it like it is, like little toddlers do, and you'd be like, I can't believe they just said that, but it's the truth. And like Jesse Jackson, for example, I was invited to speak at Rainbow Push, but he then brought up a CEO of the banking industry. And it's just like, what is you doing? You know what I mean? And it's just like so much of that is happening within the eldership. And as the younger people, we're seeing a lot of the elders now even going towards the Obama factions and the Biden factions, and those that are so not clear on militarism. They are so not clear on capitalism. They are so not clear on any of those things. You know what I mean? And our generation is facing an existential crisis where my baby may not even live to see a habitable planet to your age. So we don't care if it come from Vermont. We don't care if it come from space. I don't care if it come from the doggone caves of Gibraltar. We just want somebody that's gonna push what we need.
So we'll get to this question of the thinking of elders on the question of capitalism, which is a very serious point in this particular time. Let's hear the questions.
Yeah, I think related to that, I'm just interested, we've talked a lot about the powers that be and also these old rusty demons. And being at Yale and previously at Princeton, I'm seeing things that I don't fully understand, and you guys have experience that I do not have. So if you could elucidate who that, or what these powers that be might be, on a global scale too. We seem to be in a global Versailles.
So we're looking at capitalism and looking at kind of what's happening globally. Your question?
Yes, this is for Willie. Nice to see you again. Yes, I deal with black liberation theology of disabilities, and I see that voice is not being included. How do you, or maybe it is, but I don't see it. You know, how do you include it if it's not there?
Okay, so I'm afraid we're out of time, except to have the panelists speak to the last couple questions that, thank goodness, are related, and I think people can respond to them. So why don't we just give people a chance to respond there, and then we'll wrap up at the end of that, and then we'll proceed to dinner, where people have lots of time for more conversation. So I don't know who wants to take the first stab at it. I don't know if You want to go, and then we can just
Okay.
go around.
Just quickly, the last two questions, the analysis of capitalism and the question of the global power structures, are obviously very interconnected. And the only thing I would say, I mean, those are big questions, right? But I would say that I think one thing that I think I've learned in organizing from different political periods, you know, you operate in your political moment, right? So in the 1980s and into the 90s, I was involved in a Marxist movement. It was what we called the New Communist Movement. It wasn't the Communist Party, it was other smaller groups, but using a lot of the same political analysis. And in the movements, because movements were erupting globally, and we were seeing national liberation movements that were led by communist parties, and so that language was very much the language of the movements. That's not the case these days. That's not the kind of movements that are rising around the world. The movements now talk about human rights, about being rights-based rather than state-based. That's the kind of language that we're seeing. I think that what we have to learn, and what I think I see, it's what I think of with some of the younger people that I work with, there is a good way of talking about building an anti-capitalist movement without using the language that to many people in this country sounds rhetorical and outdated. Among some young people, it doesn't. It's making a resurgence, if you will, the language explicitly to talk about capitalism, to talk about imperialism. When I write my books and stuff, I almost never use the term imperialism. I use empire sometimes, but the reason is not that I'm not an anti-imperialist, I still am, but most people don't know what that means anymore. So I'd rather people know what I'm talking about rather than having to explain it all the time. So it's a question of strategy as much as language, but it's the exact right questions we should be having.
Yeah, I think, you know, that is the question. What are we up against? What are we dealing with? And if we don't have an accurate diagnosis, then our prescription is going to be inaccurate. And so the question you're raising, the question of class and the concentration of wealth, and how does that affect the control of our government and the media and so on and so forth, these are questions we have to answer. Otherwise, we keep diverting our anger against each other and not see really what we're up against and direct at that. Like, for example, this question of race. I would want to debate that. I mean, I grew up in a situation in the black ghettos, as I explained, where I would not wear white underwear. I only wore color underwear, because I didn't like white folks. That was my understanding. And that understanding, because of the segregation, how that way of controlling us had reached a point where that understanding of race was deep within my thinking. Now I learned, studied, develop a collectivity to understand the complexity of the problem. Let me say this quickly. It is stupid only to think with your brain only. It is smart to think with your brain plus everybody else's brain, huh? Because you can see things that I didn't see. So these complex questions have to be looked at collectively to really make an assessment so we can come with a common estimate of the problem. So I don't think the problem is this and you think the problem is that, and then when we pursue tactics, we're all in different directions. And then lastly, if you study history, and theory is about history, millions of people's experience and not just my feeling of my world, that kind of thing. You study history, and we can debate this, but this question of race is so important because it's like the elephant in the room, every room in American society. You can't understand what we're dealing with unless you deal with this question in its history and why we are separated the way we are. The history of ruling classes, which is basically 1%, all the way from the Roman Empire to today, has been a history where the ruling class has never oppressed and exploited equally. Never. The disproportion that we find with the people of color, the concentration of black and brown in the prison system, the disproportion is a deliberate way in which they are able to not only control the blacks and isolate the blacks, but to control the whites as well.
Exactly.
in Nazi Germany. It wasn't only about the isolation and Holocaust against the Jews, it was about how you get the Jewish masses, the German masses, to accept exploitation and to go die, fight and die for the Krupps, the Farbens, and the Thyssen. And this class question and the relationship to the color question is something that we have to examine, because it is a complexity, and we have to examine it collectively.
Yeah.
We should appreciate these kind of gatherings, because this is where we can begin to answer these questions, which has got to be continuously discussed. I'm sorry.
So are there other?
I think we're kind of at the time, aren't we?
So we've got this.
Yeah, okay.
Colleen's actually left the room.
Yeah.
No. No.
So the the name of the other book I've been working on is called The Centrality of the Struggle Against Racism. Every revolutionary that I have known in my 62 years in the movement, so starting when I was 20, was the only ones that I saw that really stuck with it were those that understood how central the struggle against racism was as a revolutionary movement in our country. And I believe that we need a rectification movement. Speaking of the new communist movement and everything, we need a rectification movement on how we teach black history, or black and white history, as Tim Tyson calls it, in the South. We have the shittiest curricula there's only 2 Southern schools that have anything about the history of. You have to go to the top schools to find out who Martin Luther King was. So to make it short, we need to start. I'm a Du Boisian and a John Hope Franklinist. You see, that's where we should be taught. That's where we should start, and we should say we are Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Du Boisian, and John Hope Franklinist, or something like that. And fact is, we need to study them more than we do the others, because some of them are not. They liquidated the question of race.
So I think that we've touched on some important history, some lessons, some important questions that have been raised by y'all who are sitting here, who are grappling with these questions. I think a central thing that's come out is this role of education and study and connecting the work that we do with trying to learn about history and trying to understand theories that control how the country and how the world works. And so I think that is one of the big takeaways here, not to separate our understanding and our education and our theory from the practical work that we do every day. And so I hope that you'll take that away, and that'll get us to a lot of the other very important issues that people raise, because I think that they connect, and that we can find some way to do our work as we go back to our communities better armed and better able to do what we all want to do, which is to see a better world. So I want to thank folks for being in this room for the past hour and a half, for really engaging in this. I invite people to talk to folks who you've seen up here. You know, grab them at dinner, or tomorrow grab folks, but there's a lot of work and knowledge that's sitting here in front of us, and I think really we all can learn from folks, and you should share your work with these folks so that we continue to learn how to do work now. We don't know everything, and we are all still in it because we are able to learn. We're able to learn from folks who come after us and the folks who went before us. So again, thank you, and we'll see you at dinner.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming.